Good day. It's a great honor for me to be here with you at today's SAMA conference. What I hope to do is to tell you about the COVID-19 epidemic and our response. I want to share with you the good, the bad, and the complicated. What I hope to do in all of that is to give you some perspectives. I'll give you some data. I'll share with you some of the challenges we've been grappling with. So let's plunge right into it, and let's talk to start with about where we are in the epidemic. So when you think back to the 5th of March 2020, when we had our first case, we had a rapidly growing epidemic, doubling every 2 days. But we instituted very early measures and we flattened the curve, and so we bought some time so that eventually we had our first wave in July. Now that first wave was pretty bad, but not half as bad when we look at what went on in the second wave driven by the beta variant, or what we're going through now in the third wave. And as we reflect on this last 18 months of the COVID-19 pandemic and look at the way in which we've had to deal with the admissions, the deaths, and all of those challenges, it took a Herculean task. So where are we now? Well, in this diagram, I'm comparing for you the first, second, and the third wave. The first wave in green gives you some indication about the cases and how long it lasted. And you'll see that compared to the second wave, it was a much lower epidemic, much lesser epidemic, if you want to call it that. But look at the third wave. The third wave is still meandering along, and it's still at a point where it has not yet come to low transmission. And why is that? Well, that's because it is varying at a much different pace between the different provinces. If we look at Gauteng, what we see is between the first and second waves that they were a pretty mild epidemic compared to what they dealt with in the third wave. Right? And in the first and second waves, they peaked at around 35 cases per 100,000 population. But now, in the third wave, all the way up to 76 cases per 100,000, more than twice its previous peak. And with that has come this huge deluge of admissions, all in the face of, in the difficulty that one of the most important hospitals for advanced care, the Charlotte Maxeke, was closed due to a fire. So I can only imagine how tired all of our colleagues in Gauteng must be, having dealt with this wave and now going through the last tail end of dealing with the cases that remain in hospital. But let's look at how we're doing in the other provinces. Well, in the Western Cape, you can see from the first wave, the light green line, that the cases pretty much meandered along for quite a while. Compare that to the second wave, which peaked at 48 cases per 100,000. And now in the third wave, it was deciding to do a stepped approach. We've seen cases go up and then steady and then go up. And now it's hit the peak and it's now on its way down. However, most concerning at this time is KwaZulu-Natal, where the epidemic was somewhat delayed and influenced by the unrest and the looting that we had in KwaZulu-Natal, but the cases are on the rise. We don't know where it's going to head to. Let's hope it's somewhere between the first and second wave peaks, because you can see in KwaZulu-Natal, the second wave had a very substantial peak at about 49 cases per 100,000 population. So right now we are in a situation where we are still in the midst of the third wave in some of our provinces. But when we think about all of that, sometimes in South Africa we forget, we lose sight of the reality that the whole world is dealing with COVID. We are so absorbed in dealing with it on a day-to-day basis, we forget sometimes that the whole world is dealing with COVID-19. And as we look at it, and we look at the enormity of the challenge, over 200 million cases and 4.3 million deaths, we're just a drop in that ocean in South Africa. But we've got to deal with it, and we've got to deal with it decisively. So let's go on to look at what has been good. What are some of the lessons that we've learned? What has come out that's been good? I'm going to talk about scientific innovations. I'm going to talk about oxygen supply, vaccines, and some of our proactive response. So let's go straight into innovations. It is nothing short of miraculous to think of the fact that we were able to develop, and I talk about we as a royal we in the scientific community, that the scientific community was able to develop so many vaccines, many of them incredibly high efficacy in such a short period of time. Within 9 months of the virus being described in the first cases, we had an efficacious vaccine. And you look now, we've got several vaccines in 4 different classes that have now become widespread in their use. We've also had innovations in diagnostics. When you think back to HIV, from the time we saw reports of the first cases to the time that the virus was first described was 2.5 years. And it took another almost a year before we had diagnostic tests to look for HIV. So compare that to now, where from the first cases that were reported to the point at which we had the virus described was 11 days. And another 2 weeks later, the first kits became available. Nothing short of amazing. Even in the treatment realm, when we look at tocilizumab, when we look at dexamethasone and all the clinical trials that have shown those amazing results, scientific innovations have been really important. And let's look at what the net effect has been of all of that innovation in vaccines. I'm presenting here data from the UK. So on the left-hand side, in the orange bars, you can see the second wave, and that was before vaccination had been provided. On the right-hand side, in the gray bars, you see the third wave where vaccination was provided. So let's look on the left side of both those graphs. And what you see in each of the days of this epidemic, the cases rising rapidly. So even though the population is vaccinated in the third wave, the cases rose. And that's a reflection of the number of unvaccinated people in the population and the smaller numbers of breakthrough infections amongst the vaccinated. But the one thing that's clear is that even if vaccinated, the UK still dealt with its third wave. But the heartening reality is when you look at the right-hand side of both diagrams, when you look at the third wave compared to the second wave. So in the second wave, what you see is how mortality rose. In the third wave, mortality has remained low. The benefit that we're seeing, the individual benefit of receiving vaccinations, has been an amazing story to tell of the innovation of vaccines throughout the world. But if we look at South Africa, after a slow start, South Africa has been making rapid progress with its vaccinations. We saw a steady and very substantial incline. It will always go through peaks and troughs, and that's part and parcel of how vaccine rollouts work, with early adopters coming in, and then you've got the laggards, and then you've got those who are the hesitant. We're going to have to deal with all of those. But as you look at it, it's quite striking to see how from the time of the first vaccine to the time was administered in December, to South Africa rolling out initially the Sisonke trial within a matter of about 3 months, and then 2 months later rolling out our vaccine program, to the point now where about 1/3 of the eligible population above age 35 has been vaccinated, has received at least 1 dose of the vaccine. And importantly, amongst our elderly, that is those above 60 years, about 4.8 million doses have been given to that group. And there's about 5.4 million people in that age group. So we're looking at the importance of rolling out our vaccine program. And we're seeing that after that slow start, some good progress being made. So let's go on to some of the other good things that have come. Here I'm talking about oxygen supply. So we realized very early on in the Ministerial Advisory Committee that oxygen was going to be a very important activity, that oxygen availability is going to save lives. And so a Ministerial Advisory Committee advisory was provided, and based on that, the government, the Department of Health, together with Right to Care and Deloitte, put together a very detailed plan, very carefully thought out, to ensure oxygen was available. They brought the 4 big companies together, which needed Competition Commission approval, to sit down and plot and plan that can we provide oxygen, can we secure oxygen supply to every hospital, and that's what was done. And so we never ran short of oxygen, first, second, third wave. Occasionally we run short of cylinder oxygen because patients require so much of oxygen from cylinders that we have to quickly replace them. But when we think about that there's really not been any major concern around oxygen supply, reflects the very detailed planning to make sure that enough storage facilities were available, that within 30 minutes of every hospital that oxygen can be supplied. So all of those activities and planning was done at that early point. In fact, very early on, it was back in March, April of 2020, DTI brought together a whole lot of players to say, can we build ventilators in Africa? Never been done. Well, DeFi, the company that makes your microwaves and your stoves and your fridges, came to the party. They reorientated their production line and started rolling out the first of the ventilators. And so on, you see somebody being supplied with nasal cannula oxygen. The machines that are providing that oxygen often come from DeFi. So South Africans have been able to do amazing things in this epidemic. I've simply marveled at how much has been accomplished. And when you think about our overall response and think about all of the scientific uncertainty we had, the government brought together a group of scientists, created an advisory committee, and the response that was eventually generated in the COVID-19 epidemic has largely been driven by science. In an analysis that I undertook together with the colleagues in the Secretariat of the MAC, we looked at every one of the 119 advisories in the first year of the pandemic. And what we looked at is whether each of those was implemented or not implemented or partially implemented. Very interestingly, 81% of those advisories were implemented. Some were only partially implemented and 4 were not implemented. By the way, one of those 4 was our advisory that certain groups be exempted from masks. Just as an example of what was being implemented and not being implemented. Let me end off with one of the things that has really taken me aback. I have marveled at the amount of information that's being shared. You know, I did my first epidemic investigation back in the 1980s of a measles epidemic in northern KwaZulu-Natal. Worked on TB, chaired the polio expert committee that oversaw elimination of polio in South Africa with Barry Shube and others. And when we think back to all of these pandemics, I've never seen this amount of communication where every day you know how many cases, you know how many tests, how many deaths, how many vaccinated, and there's weekly, televised updates from the minister, the president calls family meetings, and SAMA has played a critical role in all of that communication, ensuring that the public gets information and knows what is going on in this pandemic. And for me, that has been an amazing accomplishment. I can't see us going back to the next epidemic of whatever kind and not having this kind of openness and this kind of communication becoming available. So I hope I've given you a perspective of, the scientific innovations, the way in which oxygen was supplied, the vaccines and what they've managed to achieve, and given you some idea about the nature of the response. Now I'm going to turn to, so what was bad? I'm going to talk about the impact on services, corruption, new variants, and vaccine nationalism. So, if we look at, and I'm just sharing with you here, 2 of the papers we published from our group, looking at the impact on HIV and TB services, what we saw is that even though clinics and hospitals were open during the lockdown, people were just apprehensive. They were scared to go to the health services. That's where the COVID patients were. And so what we saw is people were hesitant. And so HIV testing declined, ART initiations declined, but fortunately, most of the patients who needed ART, they found ways in which to deal with that. And so we found very few patients had compromised their antiretroviral therapy. TB notifications have also gone down in this time. So we've seen how the level 5 lockdown has had a negative impact on our healthcare provision. Fortunately, much of that was undone as those restrictions were eased. But the impact remains a concern. The second I want to talk about is the corruption and the human rights abuses. It's quite deeply concerning. If you take that, when we originally went into level 5 lockdown, we didn't really understand the nature of this virus, how it was going to spread, would people follow the rules? And so government brought into the play about 70,000 troops were mobilized to oversee the level 5 lockdown. That's a lot of soldiers. If you take during the most recent unrest and looting, they mobilized 2,500 soldiers compared to the 70,000 that were mobilized during level 5 lockdown. And really, unfortunately, what we saw was the implicated soldiers in the Collins Koza killing that violated his fundamental human rights. It's deeply, deeply concerning that that had to happen. I think for me, what was also particularly concerning was not just that it happened, but that there has been no clear repercussions from within the department, that it is taking an external court case to deal with the culprits. But we've seen, for me, what has been really disheartening to watch the corruption that has seeped into the PPE spending. And I thought I would share with you, that it's not unique to South Africa. Doesn't make it any better, but even in the UK, what we're seeing is, in this article from The Guardian, that about 1/5 of UK COVID contracts have some suspicion of possible corruption. And so what we've seen is, this was an opportunity for the corrupt, and they took that opportunity and they used that. And it takes a particular kind of low individual to really exploit the country at that critical, vulnerable time. Let me talk now about the emergence of variants. We saw from the time of the first cases being reported on the 30th of December that within a matter of almost a month, the WHO declared a public health emergency of international concern. But since then, we had a period of relative quiescence in terms of new variants until November, when we saw the first cases in South Africa. We were trying to understand what this new virus looked like. And eventually on the 14th of December, the UK announced the Alpha variant. South Africa followed shortly thereafter with describing the Beta variant, and Brazil shortly thereafter the Gamma variant. And most recently in March of this year, we heard of the Delta variant that was reported from India. What we have seen is that all of the euphoria we had from vaccines, that the variants have changed that perspective. Would the variants escape vaccine immunity? Will our vaccines continue to work? It's asked a whole lot of questions. But let's look at, in this particular example, of one of the real serious implications and the impact of these variants. Here I'm showing you the first wave in India, in Brazil, and in South Africa. Actually, if you look at India, they didn't really have much of a first wave. The politicians after the first wave declared, oh, India, we've conquered this virus. It's not a problem in our country. And in Brazil, you can see how the first wave was pretty nasty, and South Africa dealt with quite a severe first wave. But look at how the variants have changed that picture. In India, the Delta variant caused an enormous epidemic. It was heart-wrenching to watch the pictures of how India struggled with its Delta wave, its Delta variant-driven wave, where patients just couldn't get into hospitals. Oxygen supply was short, and every aspect of healthcare in India was being challenged. In Brazil, the Gamma variant drove a completely new wave, even before the first wave ended. And Brazil and much of Southern America is still dealing with the challenges of the Gamma variant. In South Africa, we had the Beta variant that drove our second wave, and now the Delta variant driving the third wave. Variants are now driving new waves across the world. Delta has become dominant across the world. One of the deep concerns, the fact that has made me wish that we could change the world order, was to see how wealthy countries ordered so many vaccines, and that created a shortage among the many other factors. So if we look at, on the right-hand side, a country like Canada has purchased about 10 doses of vaccines for every one of its citizens. And so what has happened is that through their buying power, they were able to buy, through advanced market commitments, vaccines, and so too other countries like Australia and Britain, the US, and all of that has created a situation where we have surpluses in some of those countries now, while we still have shortages in Africa. We look at Africa because it has been dependent on COVAX, and COVAX has not been able to deliver the doses required. It depended on the Serum Institute of India, which stopped supplying COVAX when India went through its own Delta wave. So what we are seeing is vaccine nationalism that is depriving the poor countries of the doses that they so urgently need. Let me touch on, for me, one of the underlying problems, and that's the market forces, then the political influence that is determining vaccine access. So if we look at the different groups that were able to access vaccines, so those countries, there were 6 principal countries, US, UK, and so on, who actually developed their own vaccines. So they put their own government's funding, you see Operation Warp Speed, developing their own vaccines, so they had immediate access to vaccines as soon as they were shown to be efficacious. Then you had those countries which had financial clout, who could buy vaccines even before we knew whether they worked or not, and through advanced market commitments. And those are countries like Israel, Denmark, Canada. And so those secured vaccines as the next group as vaccines became available beyond the supply requirements of the first batch of countries. And then you saw vaccine diplomacy, where countries like Russia and China and others were using vaccines to support their friends and in fact make new ones. And then we saw bilateral purchasing. That's just using the market forces. You have a vaccine, we want to buy a vaccine, and then finally COVAX. So it's in that order that vaccines became available. And so South Africa, of course, was at the back of the queue because we didn't go with vaccine diplomacy, we didn't make advanced market commitments because of the financial clout required, and so we depended on bilateral purchasing and COVAX. And we've seen the challenges that that has led to. And for me, one of the big concerns has been that many countries who were able to vaccinate quite fast, even though they didn't make vaccines and they didn't put advanced market commitments, they have been part and parcel of this vaccine diplomacy. And we've seen it and the way in which it's reared its head across the world. We've seen, for example, most recently in Tunisia, they've got a whole lot of vaccines. About half of all the vaccines they require have been donated to them by various countries trying to influence that fledgling democracy. And so as we think about how vaccines and the market forces and the political forces have influenced access, it's really disappointing. And I would hope that as we go into the next pandemic, we would have a better system of distributing vaccines. So let me deal with the last part of what I want to talk about. I've told you about the good, I've told you about the bad, now let me tell you about the complicated. I'm telling you about the difficult decisions and the conspiracy theories. So let's start with that when we were dealing with this pandemic right at the beginning, we dealt with it in a way that we didn't really fully understand all of it. And so what was needed is we needed to bravely face that problem and make difficult decisions and act decisively. We didn't do that in HIV, but when it came to COVID, we're very fortunate that we had a government, a president that was willing to make those difficult decisions very early on. We saw how in the US, having a president that wasn't willing to do this, a president in denial, oh, the coronavirus is going to disappear in the summer. And time is of the essence. Neil Ferguson, an advisor to the UK government, showed that just a 1 week delay in the UK in instituting a lockdown led to a doubling of the number of deaths in April. So just calling a lockdown in the UK, which delayed its lockdown, calling it 1 week earlier would have a marked impact, halving the number of deaths in April. That just gives you some idea of how important it is to act rapidly. In the midst of all of this, of course, we're dealing with conspiracy theories, we're dealing with miracle cures, we're dealing with anti-vax information. I mean, in the first wave, I had to deal with hydroxychloroquine and the number of people that wanted to use it, and we'll say, why isn't it available? In the second wave, I had to deal with ivermectin, and people were, why are you not using ivermectin? And people want their miracle cures. They want something, and you're holding them back from it. They're not interested in the scientific evidence that's available. And we saw how, with all these conspiracy theories, that the damage it can concern. And most recently, we've even seen how medical personnel are spreading lies and misinformation and redirecting people away from scientifically proven medical interventions. But we've also seen how truthfulness has been a casualty in this pandemic. We've seen how, for example, early on in September last year, we've had comments like people in high density areas have generated this immunity because of previous widespread exposure to common viruses. And this professor believes that 40 to 45% of the population already contracted the virus and reaching the threshold required for herd immunity. And saying this in another newspaper, another news service, that the only plausible way to explain this decline in the first wave is that some sort of herd immunity has been reached. We've seen how that's simply not true. But we've seen how doctors are even falsely claiming that the coronavirus is no worse than the flu. And we've seen that repeatedly across the board. I want to just touch on the issue of the miracle cure of ivermectin. Just a few days ago, we saw the release of the Cochrane review. This is probably the most substantive and the most scientifically rigorous review of all of the evidence on ivermectin. And basically what they found, 14 small, mainly low quality studies that does not support the use of ivermectin. And importantly, one of the most compelling studies, a very early study undertaken in Egypt, was now found to be data that's highly questionable. In fact, it was a University of London master's student that found widespread duplication of patient information, incoherent data. And you must know this preprint, it hasn't been published ever, it's still a preprint, has had over 150,000 views. It's been very influential because it found 90% protection. And now that has been withdrawn because the suggestions is strong evidence of scientific fraud. And so the whole world has been being influenced to use ivermectin based on scientific fraud. And that's what we're having to deal with in this pandemic. Let me just touch on the vaccine rollout briefly. So the MAC on COVID-19 didn't deal at any point with vaccines. We've got no advisories that dealt with vaccines. And in August last year, the minister decided that he will establish a specific MAC that will deal with vaccines. And so the vaccine MAC was established on the 15th of September. 2 days later, they submitted an advisory for the government to join COVAX. And a few days, barely a week or two later, they started meeting with various companies to secure, in terms of bilateral arrangements, to get vaccines. Disappointingly, and it's really disheartening to see how the government missed paying for COVAX. It missed deadline after deadline. Even when COVAX rescheduled the deadline, they missed the deadline. It really showed a lack of commitment to dealing and ensuring that we could access our vaccines through COVAX. But that is just the first of the 4 real setbacks we had to deal with. The second was, no sooner had the government engaged in vaccine nationalism by bypassing COVAX, securing vaccines using political influence, and the AstraZeneca doses arrive, and we hear the unfortunate results that the vaccine is really not very effective in preventing clinical illness. We had to scrap that idea and quickly pivot to providing the J&J vaccine through Sisonke. But the challenges and the setbacks continued. No sooner had we signed an agreement to get J&J vaccines, we have a problem that the doses that were supposed to come to us, that there's a problem in the Baltimore factory, and so almost 2 million doses had to be destroyed. And eventually, when Aspen delivered the first 1.5 million J&J doses, it now emerges that they had already made 32 million doses that they had given to Europe. So we've had setback, and some of it government's doing, some of it nature of the virus, some of it international politics and all of the challenges that go with trying to access vaccines. Some have raised the question, should herd immunity be dismissed? Are we ready to ditch that and move on? Are we not in a position to focus on trying to have some degree of control of the virus? Is there no population benefit from vaccines? Well, the answer to that is complicated. It's complicated because there are many factors that influence herd immunity. Herd immunity is essentially that when you vaccinate enough people in the population, that it protects even those who are not vaccinated. So fundamental to that is the R0 of the virus. So if a virus is spreading rapidly, in other words, it has a high R0, then you need to get to a much higher level of vaccine coverage. The other problem is that we have to ensure that vaccinated people don't transmit. If vaccinated people are going to transmit the virus to any significant extent, then it will undermine our prospects of herd immunity. Well, fortunately, most of the vaccines seem to have done reasonably well. Delta is creating new challenges, though, on that front. But as we look at the available evidence emerging, we have now seen some excellent studies that have now come out. One showing that transmission in households are being impacted. And you're seeing how there's a 79% decrease in infection rates when those who are unvaccinated are exposed to an infected individual compared to those who've been vaccinated. And we see how there's now community level evidence that's emerging of vaccine protection of unvaccinated individuals. And in this study from Israel, it really is fascinating to see that about every 20% increase in vaccination decreases positive tests by about 50%. So there's quite a marked impact at a community level. And this is in the unvaccinated. So this is vaccinated individuals are leading to unvaccinated people being protected. And that's what we're hoping for, because it's virtually impossible to vaccinate 100%. So we want to get to enough people that we will see the benefits in the unvaccinated. So that will help us slow down the spread of this virus. So can we ditch herd immunity? I don't think so. We need to keep it as a goal. It might be a difficult goal. Certainly the evidence is pointing to one that's going to be a real challenge to get to, but it's an aspirational goal, and certainly one I believe we should maintain. Let's look at the variants. So how do variants occur? Well, the first is we've seen slow genetic drift occur with variants, with these viruses. But the variants are being created in immunocompromised individuals. And in those immunocompromised individuals, we're seeing that the virus is mutating multifold, that you're getting multiple mutations occurring because of persistent infection. Let's use, I've just provided you with some of the kinds of immunocompromised individuals. We've got some individuals who are receiving immunosuppressants for transplantation, patients with lymphomas, patients who are immunocompromised because of leukemia or for advanced HIV. I mean, there's a whole range of people who are very severely compromised, immunocompromised, and they are becoming the source of new variants. Let me touch on boosters. It's a question that's being asked all the time. And you've seen how WHO has called for a moratorium on boosters, at least until the end of September, because of the need for global access to vaccines in poor countries. So why are rich countries, Israel, France, Germany, and others, giving third dose boosters when many poor people in poor countries haven't even received their first dose yet? Well, there are four basic reasons we have to address. The first is there now inadequate vaccine immune response? For example, in the elderly. If you look at the diagram on the right-hand side, you can see how those above the age of 80 have a much lower immune response in antibodies than those who are below 60. So is there a problem that in the elderly they don't have enough immunity? The second is, if you've got immunity, is it now waning? The third is our current vaccine immunity not sufficiently effective against mutated forms of the virus? And finally, is there clinical trial evidence of clinical benefit? Well, let's deal with that. Are any of these four reasons for boosters scientifically justified? Is there an inadequate vaccine response? No. The reason is we don't have a correlate of immunity. We don't have a correlate to know. So how much of antibodies do you need to have to be protected? We don't know that answer. So we don't know if there's people with inadequate immunity. We know that some are lower, some are higher. That's natural variation. But we don't know whether it's inadequate. Is immunity waning? Well, immunity always wanes. Any vaccine, you will have high antibodies initially, and it'll wane over time. But even after years, memory B cells remain. And we see in SARS-CoV-2, memory B cells in the lymph nodes can regenerate antibodies quite quickly. In fact, some of the elderly people still have antibodies against Spanish flu from 1918. And we've seen how the vaccine, the mRNA vaccines, have led to very substantial memory B cells and memory T cells after just getting 2 doses. What about the variants? Are they escaping vaccine immunity? No. mRNA vaccines remain as effective against all the current variants. And is there clinical trial efficacy for boosters? No, not yet available. There's some clinical trials looking at immunogenicity, but none on efficacy. And you must remember that vaccines and hybrid immunity, and hybrid immunity is not, thinking about hybrid cars with both batteries and petrol. No. Hybrid immunity is people who have had natural infection followed by vaccination. We've seen how vaccine immunity is much better than natural immunity. And now hybrid immunity is even better than vaccine immunity on its own. And in fact, most of the people who've received vaccine after natural infection don't even need a follow-up dose. It does very little to boost the hybrid immunity you get. And so we're seeing amazingly potent responses in hybrid immunity. Let me go on to, is booster doses warranted in the severely immunocompromised? And the answer to that is yes. When we look at patients who have HIV on ART, they seem to do pretty well. They have a pretty good immune response, as you see in the diagram on the left-hand side. But if you look at the data on the right-hand side, you see how a single patient, very severely immunocompromised, CD4 count of 20, poor immunity, even after 2 Pfizer doses. And we have a randomized controlled trial showing that in severely immunosuppressed individuals, a 3rd dose can be of assistance. And so this is the one group that I think we should seriously consider giving booster doses to, because they are important in terms of generating variants, and they do not respond always very well to 2 doses of vaccine. So what about boosters for those who've received single-dose J&J? Is there an inadequate vaccine response? Well, the evidence shows quite clearly now that after a single dose of J&J, the immunity keeps maturing over several weeks into months. Is there waning immunity? Well, we've only used this vaccine for a few months, so we don't really have that data yet, but the available data certainly doesn't suggest it's waning any more than other vaccines. Are new variants escaping the J&J? No. efficacy has remained effective. The vaccine has remained effective against all 4 variants of concern. And is there evidence that boosters help? Well, no. There's no study that's available yet that shows a single dose of J&J followed by a second dose of J&J or any other vaccine is clinically any better. So the data are still awaited. What we have seen is a study of the AstraZeneca vaccine together with the Pfizer vaccine in combination. That what we've seen is that in the yellow bar on the diagram in the bottom left-hand corner is 2 doses of AstraZeneca. And this is the antibody response. Then you see in the mustard-colored bar, you're seeing the AstraZeneca vaccine followed by the Pfizer vaccine. You can see how Pfizer vaccine following AstraZeneca does better than 2 doses of the AstraZeneca vaccine. And it's quite similar to just getting 2 doses of Pfizer, actually, as it stands. But it shows that, actually, if you give it the other way around, giving Pfizer first and then AstraZeneca, it doesn't do as well. So, essentially, if you're going to boost the AstraZeneca vaccine, instead of giving another AstraZeneca vaccine, you could do just as well giving a booster dose with the Pfizer vaccine for B-cell immunity. So who is promoting these vaccines? Who's promoting these boosters? Well, Moderna and Pfizer have been looking at promoting these, and we've seen how both have been talking about the need for booster doses. And I'll leave you to guess why they are promoting it. But the FDA and the CDC has said, not so fast. Interestingly, the CEO of BioNTech says there's no need for vaccine boosters at this point. So let me touch on the last issue under the complicated. What may happen next? If we look at our first wave, it lasted 74 days. If you look at our second wave, it lasted 75 days. If you look at the current wave, we're around at about 80, 90 days at the moment. So it's a bit longer than the first 2 waves. But our waves seem to be somewhere between 74 and about 100 to 105 days. So what's interesting is that the interwave period has also been pretty compellingly consistent. If you look at the first interwave period, 94 days, the second, 99 days. And so if you just work on that, if that wave is repeated, you can see that we can expect to go into our fourth wave in early December and probably last till about mid-February, late February. So that's what's in store. What we can tell is that more variants are likely, more waves are likely, vaccination mandates are likely, and we're going to need to continue using public health measures, especially in certain circumstances of indoor activities and gatherings. So let me end off with all that we've learned, we need to take forward into the response to the next pandemic. So what have we learned from HIV that would be helpful in the COVID response? Let me quote you from this UNAIDS document. The AIDS movement demonstrates that with a shared vision, shared responsibility, and through global solidarity and leadership of people living with HIV-affected communities and individual action, we can change the course of history. And we have done so, making HIV something that killed people to one that's a chronic manageable condition through the Global Fund, UNITAID, PEPFAR. We're trying to do the same, create some kind of global equity and global solidarity through COVAX. So I'll end off by quoting Pope Francis. I believe he says it better than I could ever. In this editorial in the New York Times, and I quote, "The pandemic has exposed the paradox that while we are more connected, we are also more divided. To come out of this crisis better, we have to recover the knowledge that as a people, we have a shared destination. The pandemic has reminded us that no one is saved alone. What ties us to one another is what we commonly call solidarity. Solidarity is more than acts of generosity, important as they are. It is the call to embrace the reality that we are bound by the bonds of reciprocity. I am safe because you are safe. You are safe because we are all safe. No country is safe until every country is safe." On this solid foundation, we can build a better, different human future. I thank you.